Hello, and welcome to my very delayed commentary on your Google Hangout on Air 1. And just wanted to let you know that I watched your Hangout when you first recorded it and made all the notes, and I had a mysterious disappearance in the household. So I had to, on all of those Google Hangouts for your class, I had to rewatch them. So typically I believe feedback is not like revenge, it's best served hot. So I do apologize that it's getting to you so late. I guess the good thing is, though, that since you have a feedback or Google Hangout to do next week, perhaps some of the comments are going to be actionable that I leave for you right now. So generally, I wanted to tell you that Paulette was facilitating this session, I believe, or so it appeared, and you had an excellent and very comprehensive overview of the questions, which I really appreciated. It was a very thoughtful and very well-balanced presentation. You know, you all explored the topics in depth, and so I enjoyed it. One thing I wasn't sure about is I could not see Jackson, and I don't know if that was for technical reasons or by design. Not sure if he did not include the visual on purpose, or if it was just a technical glitch. So other than that, there was no serious technical difficulties or no lag time, and it was run very smoothly. So let me just go through some of the issues that you discussed and sort of recapitulate that for you. So Jesse started with number one and number two, I believe. Number one on differences between civil protection and civil defense, and I really liked your exploration of civil protection because your group, I think, was the most exhaustive in looking at those different aspects of civil protection. With the civil defense, you identified, quite quickly that it was the wartime effort approach, and pretty much it is refers to the foreign attacks. And just to give you a little bit of a background of the national defense origins in the United States, the first sort of committee on national defense was created by President Woodrow Wilson in 1916, and it was very short-lived. It was dissolved in 1921, but if you recall, in 1916, the United States got engaged as a young country for the very first time in a large international conflict, which was the First World War. So it was sort of coming of age. It was the first exposure of our national security strategy to the international conflict, so to speak. And so the national security agenda was very, very much on President Wilson's mind, and he created that National Defense Committee in order to create structures like that at the state levels and at the local levels to support the war effort. And that's a very interesting and perhaps very telling approach in the initial emergency management in our country, why the focus was on security being inherently the job of the federal government, while safety wasn't. Because if you look at hazards and threats, or if you break it down into the defense function, or threats being external and intentional, and hazards being natural, technological, inherent flaws of design, and so on and so forth. You can break it down any way you want, but I look at the issues of safety and security and their differences. So what's the difference between safety and security? One is, that intentional violation versus more spontaneous or natural or inadvertent source of risk. And so Wilson set a pace, we can say, for many, many decades to come for emergency management approach from the federal government standpoint. And civil defense was definitely a function that the federal government took on seriously. And so those civil defense committees, as they were called, they were created by President Wilson. They operated at the local level. They mostly were military folk that came down to local jurisdictions, and their job was to A, disseminate propaganda at the local level. Because again, remember, those mothers had to send the sons to wars in some countries, in Europe. And so you had to get a really strong buy-in at the local level to the United States engagement in the war. So propaganda was really, really critical. And those outlets, creating those local outlets of civil defense centers was very important. The other function that those entities had is to determine capabilities and potential threats to government functioning if we did have an external attack, because we were engaged in the armed conflict. So, for example, if you have the munition place that produces munitions for the war effort, then obviously it's located in some XYZ USA. So if we're producing in this area and the major arteries or roads get destroyed or bombed, or the whole villages get bombed and this is where the people live that will work in that factory, then it is in the federal interest to measure those capabilities, assess, create those alternative ways to house people, make sure that that production or infrastructure is vibrant or has a continuity of operations after the attack. So federal interests were paramount in those initial approaches of how federal government got involved with managing of crises. And Jackson will come back to that when you're talking about National Guard. And you discuss that when you break down the functions of the National Guard excellently. But, so President Wilson, and very interesting piece of information on that is that President Woodrow Wilson also faced another crisis during his presidency, and that was 1918 and the Spanish flu that you've been reading about. And with respect to Spanish flu, this was certainly not a federal government job to get involved at all. So they totally missed a lot of opportunities to contain and help with public information and stuff like that initially when it started. And in the US, it started in military barracks, and obviously because of the engagement in the war, it spread pretty quickly. But because it was not the national security issue, it was more of a civil protection issue, it was totally relegated to the local jurisdictions to handle it, and the federal government didn't want to have any involvement whatsoever. Now, truth be told, in the second wave of the flu, towards the end of it, of course, the outcome of the First World War was decided by 1918. But by the end of the First World War in 1918, when the flu became, really catastrophic in the United States, those civil defense centers were leveraged. So, and they were used for the pandemic effort by default, by the dual use, so to speak. So the first time you see the dual use, it's very interesting because you see a dual use. What did they do? They printed and disseminated information about the war effort in the propaganda. So what they switched to very easily was disseminating public risk information about the flu. Unfortunately, it was late, but it was that grassroots level or leveraging of the sort of federal sources or resources to help local civil protection with a case such as pandemic. But again, it was very atypical and not intentional. So Jesse was talking a little bit more about civil protection and how it differs in a sense where it is not as homogeneous, it's heterogeneous, it involves a variety of different agencies. You talked about teamwork, working with NGOs, Red Cross, and so on and so forth. And Certainly not authoritarian, because you've got to build bridges across those different agencies and different layers of local and regional and state and so on. And civil protection typically handles hazards and also threats from within, so domestic threats typically, not external or threats. So that wraps up sort of the discussion on the origins of distinction between the national defense or civil defense and civil protection. Now the next question, I think Michael had some interesting things to add, that we typically think about civil protection when we are thinking about natural hazards and not wars, and unless we're dealing with political and military leaders. And Andrea brought up a really interesting point, which sort of summarizes my thing on Wilson, that natural disasters and civil protection is the focus on civilians and not necessarily on national interests or federal interests, which is definitely a case. Federal interests were involved in civil defense because we were to maintain physical infrastructure and to maintain social infrastructure, to be continuity of government and continuity of operations, but it was not a focus of protection of citizens for the citizens' sake. So, so you can look at it, in that perspective as well. Jackson, I think you talked about the command and control approach, which is more specific to civil defense, and you mentioned that work by Robert Dines on emergent response and on community response. And certainly, all the disaster research has indicated that, planning, preparedness, emergency management needs to depart from being government-centric to be community-centric. And this is sort of, the claim made by Dines, because disasters truly and crises, when they start domestically, they originate at some local level, and the capacity is the best represented at that local level. Typically, things don't happen on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's where the policy is written. But things happen in the, anywhere USA. They land in somebody's lap at a local jurisdiction. And before you even, go even further than the community response, in a sense of a local emergency operations center or local emergency management group, before even those things get activated, is the actual citizen response that happens first, and the emergent response before the formal structures come into play. So inherently, we go back to this idea that the federal government had, that in the cases of hazards, it's the local jurisdiction that is responsible. It's a local jurisdiction that knows its capabilities, capacities, resources, talent to use, and they are much better suited to be managing and dealing with that at that level. Of course, things are different when, and that goes to mitigation, when what we think is a natural hazard is no longer a natural hazard, because, some of the things that happen to us are not caused by natural disasters, but by those activators that are human activators. So the fact that we don't mitigate, the fact that we use land or overpopulate or over-urbanize or, lobby for contracts in developments in the areas that shouldn't be, or uneven distribution of wealth, and, and disasters becoming a social issue. So disaster viewed as a sort of, more of a responsibility of a government, because it's not really natural. because it is human caused, and it should be the function of a government to protect civilians from some of that poor land use and building codes and so on and so forth, all those issues that go and speak to lack of or ignorance of mitigation proper. But a really good connection to Dines here. I really enjoyed that. You mentioned also, for some reason, you brought out a lot of movies in your discussion, but you talk about the Levees Breaking by Spike Lee film, and the appearance of a military presence or civil defense, so to speak, in communities. And I think that is a very good thing for discussion in the National Guard topic that Jackson had, that, the way the portrayal of the National Guard by a governor, by the city officials, and by a lot of people that were involved in Katrina. One of the major issues in all the reports post-Katrina was that their role was not understood. Their role as a military versus non-military, and what they were authorized to do under what, was not fully understood. Of course, that does not help with the community having a certain perception. National Guard, because of its Title X status, has a certain access to certain equipment or certain clothing, where you can talk about the militarization of that type of peace officer or militia force at the state level. So it creates the illusion or a projection that it is military, where in fact, National Guard cannot engage with civilian populations in its military capacity. It just doesn't happen. It's against the law. So it's a lack of understanding about the role of the National Guard that creates, again, this increased hypervigilance of the community, the increased unhappiness about its use in different domestic contexts. And that goes for public unrest control across a variety of different states, and the use of National Guard by the governor. That's why those distinctions are very important. But for us, again, you mentioned that militarization component, which is not aligned with the community or the ethos of the community, or even what the community knows from law enforcement typically, but hopefully it's community policing and more of that, your local cop that works your area, and maybe those relationships are not great, but at least they are in a familiar territory versus the troops of the National Guard coming in that are so far removed from that community. Okay. And so Michael also had a little discussion on how, the local community pride, and they did not want to be bossed around by over-militarized force, and did not want to listen. So there was no community trust with that particular resource deployed in Katrina. Now, I was not sure, I think we went back, Michael went back on civil defense, civil protection, and back again on the example of the Minneapolis bridge collapse, and linked it to all hazards approach, the discussion you had later. And I thought it was really, really good the way you tried to sort of illuminate on that all hazards approach being a combination of both. And you really nailed it there, that we do not know with a lot of those crises what their activator is, whether it's a threat or whether it's a hazard, whether it's security, whether it's safety, whether it was intentional or not. Because in initial moments of the crisis, you're not going to know, you're not going to have that intelligence. So you are approaching it functionally instead of worrying about what type of hazard or threat it might be, you look at it comprehensively, because regardless of the threat or hazard, regardless whether somebody meant to blow the bridge up or if a bridge just spontaneously collapsed, the issues to deal with, the anatomy of the aftermath is very similar. Paulette mentioned triage. You've got to triage. You've got to triage. You've got to treat. You've got to transport. You've got to have medical capacity. That medical capacity has to be part of the planning, right? For anything, whether it's a shrapnel wound or whether it's, somebody that got crashed in a structural collapse that was spontaneous. You're going to have that medical capacity that needs to be there. You have to have a capacity for communications. You have to have a capacity for accessing the control to the scene, limiting the access to the scene, and credentialing of people that come in there. Whether it's, if it's criminal, so if it's a security issue, you don't want people in there because, it's a crime scene. But if it's a hazard issue, you don't want people in there because you don't want them to be in harm's way. Regardless of the cause, you still have a function of holding the access to the scene, or creating those inner perimeters and outer perimeters and hot zones and defining them. So I thought, Michael, by bringing the Minneapolis bridge collapse example, you showed us how it is irrelevant in the response phase to know what exactly caused it. Well, it's not irrelevant, it's important, but you're not going to necessarily know that in the first hour, right? Who would have thought that somebody actually drives a plane into a building on purpose? It's like, until the second one ran into the second tower. So I think it was Kacey or Paulette that talked about the citizens of New Orleans that thought that, levees were actually blown up. And so, it doesn't matter whether they were blown up or let go. From the standpoint of protection, you're going to have displaced people that you're going to put somewhere. The cause of the event you can investigate later, because right now you have to contain and you have to save lives and, provide some sort of control of the environmental impact. So, so very good, interesting conversation there. Then Jesse went into doing a very, very extensive overview of the characteristics of civil protection. And you mentioned Henry Quarantelli, who happened to pass away. He passed away a couple years ago. And he had this classification into the consensus crisis and conflict crisis. His take on it was that they're a little bit different in the way, different functions they require, but discussing that civil protection, Jesse mentioned the fact that it is the area that has been accepted as a federal responsibility or responsibility of the government, as much as national security used to be. And Andrea discussed the evolution, how it became more and more and more part of the government. And I think part of the reason is because we do live in a different threat landscape that we were in during the Cold War. National defense was very easily the function of the federal government, and very logically, because it was the imminent threat to the survival and well-being of the nation. But with the enemy, so to speak, or them versus us being gone, the distinction being gone, and Soviet Union, during the 90s becoming less of a threat, and the entire dichotomy disappearing, we sort of refocused and realized that there are other threats, and they're dispersed and they're interconnected, and they don't have a geography, and they're not political necessarily. And so that civil protection started seeping more and more into being a bigger responsibility of the government. I think it is very interesting what Paulette mentioned about the civil rights era and expansion of the federal government involvement towards the late 60s, but not truly until the late 70s during the Carter administration. And Paulette mentioned that we were preoccupied with those other security issues we were dealing with, mostly with the civil rights movement and stuff like that. So we were not thinking about emergency management yet. We didn't get to that, integrating federal response for civil protection in a more centralized way, federally coordinated way. I thought there was a really interesting take on that. Again, we were focusing on threats more than we were focusing on hazards. In some countries too, as you read about Africa and Asia, where not only is civil protection a responsibility of government, a lot of those countries also have much weaker governance at the local level. So, we do have a lot of those, association boards and a lot of really strong local governance, whereas some of those other countries are very, very centralized in the way they are run and controlled. So there's a national force of some sort, national police, national fire service. And certainly, even with that, the resources and the logistical support tends, in those centralized countries with centralized governments, tend to be co-located with the military. So to speak, military has the best toys. And because they have that standardized training or, very rigid, controlled way of managing, then certainly they are a logical default for civil protection as well as civil defense. And they do that dual use. So the resources they have for war, they use for civil protection. That does not work in the United States. So, we can't use military engaging with the civilians because of the Posse Comitatus Act. And you explained that, and, you have elaborated on this. But some of the countries don't have those constitutional or legal constraints. I grew up in Poland, and Polish military, as long as I remember, was involved in flood relief and assistance for civilians, evacuating civilians, for example. We don't have military evacuating civilians in this country. Now, we do have our military going and providing humanitarian support, and it's a growing role of the U.S. military is to provide humanitarian support in disasters elsewhere in other countries, right? Because there are no legal constraints on that. Some of the things that Jesse discussed with the group, the arrangements are complex. So certainly not linear, not, just one type of, or, few types of military service, but all kinds of different organizations meshing together. Not only different organizations, but also along the plane of private and public, right? Because, our critical infrastructure, it's 89% in private hands. So really strong need for collaborative processes in civil protection. Again, issues such as public health situations. You went back to the I go back to pandemic and President Wilson. You talk about expertise that certainly traditional law enforcement or traditional response organizations might not, or might feel a little bit more out of their comfort zone in those very specialty-driven events like public health emergencies or chemical events, spills, and stuff like that. So versus active shooter events. But yet, the recognition of chemical, biological weapons and explosives and all those has been truly a growing general education for most first responders in the last decade. So again, we are going back to that civil protection from the myriad of different threats and hazards, both. All right, so Paulette was talking about those specific hazards that specific states or jurisdictions face, like Houston having floods and hurricanes versus California has earthquakes. So they will become expert in this specific hazard specifically, but you do need to have an approach that sort of cuts across a range of them, because they are becoming more ubiquitous and more large scale. And besides, you want to account for unpredictable, right? So if you have that more functional approach, or if you take that, regardless of hazard or threat, the anatomy of the crisis is very similar in building capabilities, then hopefully you're preparing for, anything, nothing ideally, but anything. With hazard-specific planning, which was pretty much the way we prepared all the way to, and I would say 2001 and 9/11, preparing for hazard-specific is that if you don't have those things happen, then your plans not practiced, not tested, the contact and phone numbers totally useless. So if you're not practicing a specific plan, then your capabilities in it erode. But if you build capabilities across a wide range of things, you're going to practice one way or another. You're going to work through it one way or another, because you're going to have something happen, right? So those exercises or multi-jurisdictional exercises that will help build capability. And I think Paulette and Andrea, you're both talking about the fact that, yes, you need to have some kind of baseline, which is what the all hazards is. It's the basic anatomy. And then within that baseline, there's going to be specific things. And what I am reminded of is this all hazard approach in national planning scenarios. And I don't know if you recall, but there were national planning scenarios that came with a national response framework, and there were 16 of them. And each scenario was looking at, if we had that type of event, what are particular capabilities that will be tested. So if we had nuclear, that's the capability that's going to be tested. Mass decontamination. And so massive groupings of people to decontaminate. If we have something that involves anthrax, that's going to be mass screening, surveillance, and prophylaxis, and within 72 hours, of exposure, and that capability will need to be tested. So for all those different things, beyond the capabilities we create for everything, now we are focusing on certain things that can happen. So that was national planning scenarios. Then you moved into mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So the emergency management disciplines, or it's often referred to as the emergency management cycle, and looking at discrete periods of crises, where they start, where they end, and what function comes after next. And that's typically how emergency management or disaster studies have been dissecting crises, for over 5 decades now. And I think you agreed that you are in response organizations, you're going to be dealing mostly with planning and response. Now, mitigation and recovery might be more not in the realm of traditional first responders, but you still have to understand the processes that take place in those. And so you had a very interesting conversation about that. I just want to propose to you that that emergency management cycle differs slightly with threats than with hazards. So if you're looking at Homeland Security mission areas, you typically see prevent, protect, respond, recover, and mitigate. But if you're looking at hazards, you're going to see plan and prepare, respond, recover, and mitigate. So it's that planning and preparedness part that's slightly different. I call it 4 Ps because you got prevent, protect, plan, prepare. Preventing and protecting goes again to intentional criminal security issues. So your active shooters, it goes to things you can do such as target hardening or, detection, surveillance, things like that. Whereas the planning and preparedness is more linked with the natural stuff. You prepare because you cannot avoid a tornado when it decides to come, right? Because it's more of a natural thing. You can't prevent it. You can't protect against it truly unless you don't live it in the area where it occurs, or don't build there. That would be part of mitigation. Then you have to plan and prepare how you're going to respond once it happens. So with threats and with security, we don't want it to happen in the first place. So we have more of this approach of preventing and protecting. I don't know if really there's that much difference between threat and hazard in reality. Whether you can prevent and protect from security threats as well as hazards. In general, you heard that saying, they only have to be right once, so you can do all the target hardening and they are going to hit the building next door. So but at least there's a little bit slight nuance between the two. And recovery, I think when you talked about the recovery of Alaska, there was the first time I think you see the distinction between restoration of lifelines and reconstruction. So recovery consists of 2 periods, really. The first one is, that you can be still in response when you start recovering, right? Because you need to put the roof over the head of people. You have to feed them, you have to keep them away from the elements, and you have to make sure that they are safe. And then they don't get into the houses that are maybe have issues with electrical outlets or, and so on and so forth. So the first part of the recovery is restoration of lifelines. And then, of course, the second part, a lot harder part, is a reconstruction. So when you were talking about the Alaska and all the funds that were sent from the federal government, they were initially meant for that short-term restoration of lifelines and not necessarily the reconstruction. But that's a nuance about recovery. I think probably the most confused part in a cycle is the difference between preparedness and mitigation. And a lot of people confuse the two concepts. So mitigation is not necessarily doing exercises or shoring up capabilities. Mitigation is also looking at how to decrease the risk by not creating a risk in the first place. So, where we build, how we build, what we use, how we, and again, this is with city planning, this is with building codes and land use and stuff like that. So it's a very difficult part, and versus planning, which is more of looking at the different capacities that you're going to need when something happens, to use or to leverage to sort of have a very short response and much shorter recovery that you would have otherwise. So planning is mostly to shorten the time of response, shorten the time of recovery. Mitigation is more of not having a risk in the first place, if that makes sense. And there is often a lot of confusion about that too. And also, I suggest to you that mitigation is the most bastardized of the spheres of emergency management. Typically requires a lot more special expertise than the other three. And by the time you get to mitigation, most of the emergency management moves on to planning for the next event. And the mitigation sort of, the policy window or the will dissipates as you move through the recovery. By the time you move to mitigation, if you look at it in that cycle, people's priorities are shifted somewhere else. And that's why we are dealing with the same problems over and over and over again. Even though we are much better at responding, much better at recovering, and much better at planning, we're not mitigating. So we can only throw that much resources at the next bigger event, or we can plan, for more and more and more things. But at some point, if we don't mitigate, then those events will be unmanageable. I think Jackson talking about the difference between planning versus managing, and you mentioned about some experiences at Texas A&M or some structures you've worked with, and I'm not sure if you worked at TEACS or what that involvement was, but certainly, leadership is critical in Homeland Security and emergency management. And so I hope one day you take a class on Homeland Security and emergency management leadership. But plans are nothing. It's people's building relationships and exchanging business cards before things happen, and and fostering understanding of each other's role and what they are bringing in the event in crisis. That's really critical. It's not the plan. Plan will never happen. What you plan for will never happen. It will always happen at a different hour. It will always happen with a different team on hand. It will always happen when you are least expecting it. Those events are unprecedented, unexpected, unaccounted for, unpleasant, all the uns. And so all the plans in the world will not give you that particular scenario. Although some come close, as the Hurricane Pam exercise in New Orleans and what actually happened in New Orleans were pretty close. So had they fixed those capabilities based on that exercise, they would have been so much better off. But most of the events you cook up, or scenarios, or worst case scenarios, they don't ever happen the same way. So it's a planning process, and within a planning process is developing and leading. So I thought that was a really good point. That brought us back to Paulette discussing flexibility. So plans cannot, again, plans, when we're talking about plans, what are plans? Plans are irrelevant. What's important is a planning process, because that's where you meet people, that's where you discuss things, that's where you get in a frame of mind of thinking through the issues. So what you actually plan for will not happen, but you will have had a process of thinking about it together, requesting the resources, knowing where, having that strategic knowledge, not necessarily the details that tend to be, the plans are full of details that, are becoming useless, right? So we can plan. After Harvey, it turned out that the Houston Fire Department did not have watercraft, did not have boats for citizen rescues. And so now in their plan, they are going to suggest that they buy more boats. But, the next event comes and there's going to be a need for something else that, you didn't have because you didn't account for. So because we're dealing with unpredictability, you can't create a plan that's going to help. But engaging in a planning process is what fosters that resiliency. Jesse went back to, combating the inherent enemies of emergency management, and then went back to complacency. And certainly, the further we move away from the critical incident, so, it's 5 years or 10 years, and, it's sort of, people become complacent. People are willing to do a lot of things right in the recovery stage, right? Because they're still dealing with the reconstruction of their lives. And then after that, they just get in other routines, and it sort of slowly shifts away from their line of sight. You talked about complacency with respect to 1993 and all the improvements that were made, but all those improvements in $100 million invested in adding things and stuff like that worked to a degree where there was a planning process, right? So you had a plan that there's going to be no rooftop rescues, and that wasn't considered as an option, but it was a plan. If there was a planning process, that would have meant that that plan was disseminated to everybody that needed to know, and that there was some kind of training that included testing, whether people know that if something happens, they can't go up. That's planning. A plan is putting in there is no rooftop rescue, and then that plan goes and sits on the shelf. So, and I think we all, get that difference. Same with, designating somebody to be in charge of, the fire warden on the floor is great. We are developing that capability of, first responders are the citizens themselves, and they're gonna be empowered to do something. And then you're supposed to do those drills, and you do a drill of 1 or 2 floors. Well, you don't know that on the 20th floor that happens to be that smoke door. So again, you have a plan, but that plan hasn't been exercised all the way through, or those capabilities haven't been tested. And I thought that was very interesting that you reached back to the 1993. Now, plans never, I think Michael said that the plans didn't work. The plans never work. The plans can't work because they're checklists and formulas, and complex events are dynamic, and they require sense making within the event. If you take a checklist and you're trying to run a complex event based on the checklist itself alone, although they are very, very helpful, then you kill adaptability, you kill innovation, you kill creativity, you kill flexibility. And that's a whole conversation Paulette started on being flexible. I thought that was really, really good. Backup and redundancy plans. Okay, yes, you're going to have your plans, and you should plan, everybody says you should plan 3 deep, which means, if your first site for something, let's say you establish a instant command post, that's where it's going to be. But also know that geographically, if this area becomes compromised, you should have one here. But the tertiary would be somewhere there, because, believe it or not, schools in 9/11 area in Manhattan had plans for evacuation to another school that was very close. So they had each other in their evacuation plans. Well, when 9/11 happened, none of those schools could execute their plans because they're all needing to evacuate. So they needed to have secondary and tertiary considerations in their planning, just to create what's called robustness and redundancy, the 2 R's of emergency management: robustness and redundancy. Redundancy is having 1 extra, 1 too many, 1 more. So that's what you talked about, plan B. And the robustness is the capacity, the enhanced capacity. So then you move to a conversation on the National Guard, and Jackson did a really great job on that. Very clear and very succinct when it's under the governor's command and control as a state resource for crisis management. And that's, certainly not a policy comitatus, and that is certainly mostly civil protection, right? And you were very clear on that. When it's federalized under Title 32 for, like it was after 9/11, it's still under the control of the governor, but it's used out of the funding and for the purposes of safeguarding the interests domestically that are, from the federal level. And that is a mixture, you said, of civil defense and protection, which was brilliant because, yes, you've got those external, it's almost like a war, but you have a domestic incident management, truly, where you're dealing with all those different publics and different organizations and stuff like that. So it's not just military function. It is not a military function. And then finally, very clearly, a civil defense when it's Title 10 and when they are basically activated by the president to be part of the military forces in the Department of Defense. And this is where it's a very, very clear policy comitatus role. So the National Guard that is under Title 10 could not legally get involved in civil protection the way we understand it. So I thought you outlined it very well on that civil defense and the different duties. For example, I think you mentioned the riots and civil protection, civil defense and protection with federal interests, and then the civil defense when it's under the military rule. And certainly for combat support. You had a very interesting conversation on, how nobody really knew where to put National Guard with respect to, what support, what role it has in Homeland Security, whether it's part of, what is it part of, and how it needs to be leveraged, and that was really interesting. Andrea took on the 1950 Disaster Relief Act. You had really, really good overview of those critical things, critical piece of legislation. Till today, most of the Stafford Acts and things like that, expanding the role of federal government for disaster relief, it sort of started then. So 1950 was that really critical year because on one hand, you had civil protection, because that is Civil Protection Act. 1950 Federal Disaster Relief Act goes to the heart of civil protection. And so it gives the government a little bit more authority to make decisions and allocations to local jurisdictions. It takes Congress out of the equation, so it creates a direct line that the president can make those decisions. So it takes it away from the Congress to the White House, and legislates different types of assistance and also stimulates local and state plans, while also giving a very fundamental, still maintaining that framework that it is a local and state that are predominantly in charge of that event, that the federal government will support when those resources are overwhelmed, when the scope of a disaster is such that it necessitates it. Interestingly, 1950 is also the year when the National Defense Act was implemented. So you're seeing, the threats on one hand and the hazards on the other, or civil protection and civil defense, two different pieces of legislation in 1950 get created at the same time and sort of run parallel. And you can say they run parallel all the way to 9/11, where you just suddenly have that crisscross of both, and we have Homeland Security. But Homeland Security, truly as a concept, it has existed. It's just those two different aspects of it, one on that defense line and one on the civil protection line didn't cross as much unless, again, you talk about default or dual use. So really good job, Andrea, on that. you talked about, then you moved on to development of and growing role of federal government throughout the 50s and 60s during the Alaska earthquake and Hurricane Betsy. And you talked about, the engagement of a president, the nomination of a special envoy from the Senate to be a liaison, you might say, perhaps a first notion of a federal principal official involved with the states and local jurisdictions for, representing a federal government, alert systems that were implemented as part of the civil defense. And so really good coverage on that. The insurance, flood insurance acts, the loans and subsidized loans. And so certainly more and more and more attention to those events, because they also damage federal interests. When your big roads or, big economy of a particular state is affected to a degree where the state is incapacitated, then federal interests are involved in linked economy. And expansions during Carter administration, Michael had that. That was really brilliant overview as well. You went very, very much in detail on how the committee was convened to assess what that federal effort had been up to 1970s. And they could attest to the fact that there was a lot of federal effort, but it was very fragmented. And obviously, if you have, let's say you have HUD, and then you have Department of Commerce, and they have different priorities as organizations, as departments, right? So of course, HUD is going to try to get money and spend money on giving people shelter, and the Department of Commerce is going to try to look at the routes and things like that, and making sure that the roads are passable and building that capability. So all those efforts, and then who is in charge, of course, was the major issue that still remains. You had some really good arguments on the unified command and how that solves the issue. But certainly, it was very clear by the 70s that the involvement of the federal government in supporting states have become quite considerable for civil protection and for defense, like Oklahoma City bombing, for example, which was during the time of James DeWitt, and it was when FEMA was still directly talking. DeWitt was talking to President Clinton at the time. So those efforts, because of competing interests of those agencies and competing styles of management and also competing priorities, it was very hard to make it a very uniform type of resource allocation or policy or standards. And even though, there are some frameworks and so on and so forth that Michael elaborated on, the National Governors Associations were pushing for a more centralized approach, and Carter birthed FEMA. And so certainly, in addition to a lot of other things during the Carter era, and, contributing to the national defense, really, because when you think about the peace talks and stuff in the 70s, and everything that happened on our national security policy agenda, certainly Carter was instrumental to bring that critical civil protection piece into a very into a spotlight of the federal government, and so that's a huge contribution for creating those federal disaster administration, the insurance, the Department of Preparedness, and the fire capacity, all under FEMA. So, Emergency Management Institute, EMI, and Emmitsburg and stuff like that, all those things wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for that effort. Very important point to remember with that, when FEMA was created, it was a cabinet level agency, so which means it was like a Department of Homeland Security. I mean, it had the FEMA person was talking to the president, and in 9/11 that all the all changed. And so when you're talking about Michael Brown and the issues in Katrina, and the fact that Michael Brown got thrown under the bus, but the changes that happened post 9/11 with FEMA structurally really affected its effectiveness in during Hurricane Katrina. So a lot of its stuff was structural, although there was leadership issues obviously as well. And then you moved into Jesse and Kacey. I think you were talking about incident command posts and command centers and who is in charge in unified command, all those different functions that evolved to mitigate those fragmentation issues that we were discussing. And that's really mostly the trend since 9/11. So we had to wait really from the 70s all the way to 2000s to sort of had a more comprehensive approach to domestic incident management. It was still those two silos going parallel, the defense and then civil protection under FEMA already as an agency. Dual use, again, I mentioned that dual use during the pandemic of 1918, where the dissemination of information happened from that propaganda office. Now they're using it for a pandemic. You mentioned the Cold War era when, of course, nuclear attack didn't happen, and yet those capabilities were built and they were being used when they were needed with events that had actually occurred and had frequency such as natural disasters. So really good points on that. And the video on civil defense, it's interesting, for some of you, you were born after the Cold War era. I actually lived the Cold War era, and I remember all those really wonderful government educational programs. And we actually had civil defense classes when I was going to school, and we had to, prepare for potential nuclear fallout. And we thought at the time that all that stuff was really ridiculous because it was unrealistic. But it did certainly created an illusion that the government was trying to do something for the public. But I think more importantly, it was giving people reassurance that they can have some kind of dose of control over those events. So perhaps attenuated the fears. As far as today, make a kid and be prepared. And, the question, I think that there's some lack of clarity was a Hurricane Florence. So, how does, make a kid be prepared help you in mega complex disasters like Harvey? Filling out a bathtub full of water so you can have drinking water doesn't help you much in Harvey. Having batteries when you have to, evacuate really, really large distances and you are separated and so on and so forth, is that a really good adjustment? Are those disaster kids kind of like, those illusions of preparedness from the defense? And I think, you had a consensus that preparedness and thinking about those issues helps awareness, helps this, mental processes, having, you are always your first responder. I think Paulette mentioned that. And also, having that sense that you have more control over the events. But certainly, all the studies, I'll tell you, in conclusion, that most of the research indicates people don't prepare for disaster. And, I don't expect that anything is going to change. They never will. Some people prepare more than others. People that have children, based on research, prepare a little bit more than others. Females prepare more than males. The households that have endured a particular event, I think that's what Michael was talking about. They're already calling contractors. They are prepared more by the virtue of having gone through the moves. So, of course, they're going to know that particular recovery process better or response process better. But the recent report by FEMA, National Preparedness, indicates that it's about on 16% of households' minds. So, less than 20% of people prepare. And if they do prepare, it's very, very simple adjustments that are doable, that can be cost effective. So, you're not going to bury your whole yard or carve up L-shaped ditches in it or invest $200 in the 60s. So today it would be several $1,000s in a generator. Those adjustments are not common because, most of the people don't have the type of money to invest. And 50-some% in that survey said it's not even prepared, it's not even on the radar. Even though the government really, really wants the publics to prepare, they generally do not. So 80% of the population doesn't, and that's the reality. And that is consistent across the decades of research. So I think that civil protection is becoming larger and larger and will continue to become a larger and larger part of the responsibility of governments versus publics, because the mitigation is not happening. But that's, a totally different conversation. So I wanted to thank you again for really good contributions and a really good conversation. And I'm looking forward to your second Google Hangout, and I'll hope to have feedback to you quicker this time. And I wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. See you next time.